Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, as regular listeners will know by now, I'm not a big fan of the phrase new normal. But there is another phrase that is getting my goat at the moment, and that, of course, is the Great Reset. But despite my disdain of these phrases, I do accept that our world has changed forever, and some of these changes can be for the better. For example, businesses only used to have access to talent in their immediate region. Then they had to go through a lengthy recruitment process and navigate around lengthy notice periods before you can even think about getting that ideal candidate and getting them to work on the task that you need them to complete. But now, businesses need to deploy and manage talent everywhere. And a company called Topia is making that process easier than ever. And that's a subject I want to dive a little bit deeper in today. So buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to Cambridge so we can speak with Steve Black, co-founder and chief strategy officer at Topia. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
I'm Steve Black, co-founder and chief strategy officer at Topia. For those that aren't knowledgeable of Topia, we're a leader in the global talent mobility space. And that's all about empowering companies to deploy, manage, and engage their employees anywhere in the world. And talent mobility traditionally has been around these long-term assignments where you might send at great cost an executive around the world. Mm-hmm. But over the last decade, we've seen huge growth in new models of talent mobility, one-way moves, lower cost assignments, and quite a bit of cross-border recruiting. And there's definitely been a generational shift on the top of it where a lot of folks are raising their hand earlier in their careers to get that international experience. So obviously this year's changed that quite a bit with physical movement of people around the globe dropping off dramatically. But we've seen a big spike in the need for organizations to understand where their employees are and deal with the complex remote work, tax, payroll, and compliance challenges that go with it.
Man, I suspect that if we had this same conversation in January of this year, it would have been completely different because the world has completely changed within a matter of months, really. But before we talk about Topia and the journey that you've been on, can you tell me more about how COVID has created challenges with employees who are now working not just in the office or at home, they're working anywhere and everywhere?
Absolutely. It's been quite the year, to say the least. Yeah. I think the first thing we saw as COVID really started to develop, in the March, April timeframe was organizations' first question was, where are my people, right? Who's out there? Who do I need to bring home before borders close? Who am I going to leave where they are? And a lot of challenge and frankly, spreadsheet tracking happening around the world at big organizations. We saw some companies rush to bring home those expats quickly before borders closed. And I'd say others offered the chance to come back or stay. And a lot of folks chose to stay, where they were. At that point in time, of course, we didn't know if this was going to be a few months. We're here we are closing in on November with no real end in sight. And so the dynamic and the conversation has certainly shifted over the course of the year. I think we've seen that first step of knowledge gap of where are my folks. And now really, as we got into stability from May onwards, the question shifted to, okay, what does this new world look like? And what do I need to be thinking about that I hadn't really considered before? I think this question of where my employees are working historically was really centered around, 5, 10, 20% of an employees within an organization, a handful of business travelers, sales folks on the road, that sort of thing. But with COVID, as you alluded to there, everyone's been at home, at least for part and many full time. And I think that we've seen this real shift in mindset from employees of maybe I want to work at home to I'm not sure how productive I'll be, to frankly, we've all had to adjust and make the best of it. And, organizations are starting to uncover, now in the second half of the year that folks, packed up house and maybe went to live with parents or went to work from a vacation home or otherwise right over the course of this year. And so it's now about, okay, how do I think about planning future policy? How do I think about designing rules of engagement if an employee wants to work remotely full time or wants to flex and work a couple of months a year from another location? And with this movement of people, there's a whole host of new risks that come up for companies. In the US, there's tax savings opportunities for folks working outside of major cities like New York and San Francisco. Obviously, there's risk across the world of employees working in a country they're not supposed to be in from a tax or social security perspective. And organizations can have pretty big compliance and corporate tax risk if employees are places they shouldn't be. And I think the interesting thing is for most of 2020, governments are being very, very reasonable, folks stuck in countries and can't get back home and those sorts of things. But as we look towards 2021, we're really expecting a big spike in compliance crackdown, audits, and the like. So organizations are really scrambling to get their policies and procedures in place to think about this new world of work at scale.
And there really seems to be an increase in employee tracking too. That's a trend that I've seen over the last few months where, in particular, if people are traveling for the weekend or going away to visit relatives, many are required to tell HR where they went before coming back in the office. And I know some will feel like that's a violation of their privacy, whereas companies need that information for the safety of all employees that they look at. They look after during COVID-19, especially when we're dealing with hot zones too. So I'm curious, how are you seeing companies getting that balance right?
It's been a real challenge for sure. I think when I really take a step back and look at it, fundamentally, employees want to do the right thing. They want to keep everyone safe. They don't want to get sick or get others sick. I think the struggle really comes down to trust. Right. And this big brother expectation or conversation. So it's one thing if my employer wants to understand if I've traveled to a hot zone recently. I think that's a reasonable expectation and a reasonable question. It's a whole nother thing if my employer wants to install, key logging software to see how many minutes I was at my laptop, versus not yesterday. And I think we've seen a bit of a mix of those conversations, and sometimes those lines get blurred. And for me, I generally boil it down to two simple recommendations for companies. One is be clear about what data you're collecting, how it's going to be used, and when it's going to be deleted. Right? The employer doesn't need to know if I'm at the pub, in the middle of the day or interviewing at a competitor's office. They shouldn't know if I went, to my dad's house in Chicago or a fancy resort in the Alps for a holiday. And frankly, employers shouldn't want to know that either. They're just as worried about the compliance risks and GDPR as employees are. But the second piece really is about only recommending to companies that you only track absolutely what you need to. And for most cases, that's at the tax jurisdiction level. So, from my company perspective, it frankly doesn't matter if I'm working in London or Leeds, no different. But if I'm in a different country, that absolutely does matter. And in the US, it may be across state lines or city lines in some cases where there's city-specific taxes like San Francisco or New York City. But even within that, what street I'm on or what time I left the office doesn't matter either. So with clear rules around what exactly I'm going to store, how it's going to be used, and clear communication and open dialogue, we've seen organizations able to get that right mix of tracking without invading privacy or getting too detailed beyond what they really need.
And for people listening that are hearing about Topia for the first time, can you tell me a little bit more about your role in all this, in breaking down the barriers between people and places so companies and individuals can indeed work anywhere and everywhere?
Yeah, of course. Topia was originally founded on the back of personal pain. So myself and our other founder had experiences living and working around the world. I'm calling in today from England, though the accent is a dead giveaway that I'm from the States originally. And as I went through that personal process, I really struggled with the lack of technology, the lack of information that was available at my fingertips. right? I think we've all come to expect you pull out your phone and you can get whatever you need whenever you need it. And, sadly, at least a few years ago, mobility certainly wasn't in that place. And it was, PDFs and still the odd fax back then, which is hard to believe. And so, from a Topia perspective, our technology enables organizations to deliver mobility as part of their broader talent strategy. And that really is all types of employee movement, whether that's business travel, back when that used to happen, and as it picks up again, whether that's more traditional relocations and assignments, as I talked about earlier, or whether that's about defining the right policies for flexible and remote work. And so, we've spent, I guess, the better part of the last decade now really thinking about delivering a technology that, on one hand, gives a great experience for the individual themselves and their families, but on the other hand, gives the tools to the organization to deal with this increasing web of complexity, this need to have higher efficiency within teams, and ultimately a need to have much greater visibility around cost and compliance than they've ever had before. So, the model and the platform is flexible enough to, really work with organizations that have as few as, a handful of business travelers, or some of our larger clients like Dell that might have a few thousand international assignments a year. And that's one of my favorite things about technology is how it can flex to meet a variety of different sizes and shapes of need.
It's a great point there about technology flexing to those different sizes and needs. Because like I said a few moments ago, if we had this conversation in January this year, much of it would have been, very visionary and nice to have in the future. Mm-hmm. But obviously everything's completely changed now. So I'm curious, have you seen a huge increase in demand for a technology platform that helps enterprise companies manage their global talent mobility strategy? And are businesses waking up to the fact that they must do it sooner rather than later too?
It's been a very interesting evolution over the course of this year. I think we saw, as we were heading into this year and at the end of last year, we were seeing organizations starting to really understand the need to be thinking about their global employee footprint, global talent mobility being part of that talent strategy. And the definition of mobility at that point in time was this more traditional permanent transfer, cross-border recruiting, assignment management sort of puzzle. So as we got into March and April, there was an initial reaction of, hey, nobody's moving. I'm not really sure we need this stuff, or even in some cases, this function. But very quickly, organizations started to see and understand that the world of remote work with employees across city, state, or country lines, employees wanting to work from home and starting to raise their hand and ask to relocate to be closer to family is incredibly complex. And the types of information, business process automation and compliance logic is the exact same type of information that you need for that more traditional talent mobility management. So we've seen, probably a shift if I looked across our product portfolio more towards Topia Compass, which is our employee location tracking and visibility solution to solve these compliance challenges and take advantage of some of the tax savings opportunities. And probably a bit less of a focus, at least at smaller organizations, around some of that traditional mobility management. But the other thing that we've certainly seen and where we continue to see demand for technology is you have large multinational organizations that may have hundreds or thousands of assignees out there in the world, still to this day. And they're dealing, those challenges of payroll, of tax, of compliance haven't stopped. And if anything, there's been great cost pressure within organizations to service those people more effectively. So how do we reduce the costs? Where can we save money? How do we squeeze efficiency out of our internal teams, et cetera? So again, slightly different use cases than maybe perhaps last year, but all of it really driving pressure and visibility on these talent mobility teams and an increased sort of awareness and understanding around the need for technology. And interestingly, and exciting for us, certainly this week, Fazaway, one of the Europe's largest and most influential tech analysts, for the first time ever covered the global talent mobility space as part of their most recent 9-grid announcement. And for us, that was a great sort of validation of the category as a whole and of Topia specifically. But really, I think understanding that as the landscape shifts and we enter this new world of work, technology is going to continue to be a core requirement to really deliver on that talent strategy.
At Topia, you focus on employee movement, remote and distributed workforces, business travel, and more traditional relocations and assignments. But I'm curious, how do employee experiences differ? And do you need a different strategy for each?
The needs and the worries at the individual level certainly differ. Yeah. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got a senior exec who's moving with her family halfway around the world, maybe with school-age children. And the complexity and the uncertainty there is certainly very different than a 22-year-old who's going on a business trip for a couple of days, maybe cross country. So at one end of the spectrum, the number of vendors that are involved, the data points and information you need are very different. On the other end, it's all underpinned by a similar set of business processes, compliance questions, and integrations. And so, once you can solve the complex end of the spectrum, the process and technology can flex to solve the easier end of the spectrum, though the easier end typically comes at, 10 or 20x the volume in terms of the number of people impacted by that in a given year. So that baseline of process automation, connecting the dots between a variety of systems and providers is still there, though ultimately the experience for each individual will be a bit different. And I think it's that, and we've seen this right in recruiting technology, learning technology, and others. It's about an underlying platform that can flex to the needs of the individual. And I think that story holds true very much so in global talent mobility.
And you must have had a lot of opportunities this year as much of the world wakes up to your way of thinking here. But what have been your biggest challenges this year?
Absolutely. It's been a wild one. I think one of the things we acquired a company back in May, just as we were getting to the heights of global pandemic. So integrating a new team, integrating a new technology in the midst of all that change was certainly a challenge individually, though. It's actually come together probably much faster and much better and more impactful than I might have expected given the climate. Obviously, from a macro perspective, a big challenge for us and many of our customers as physical movement screeched to a halt. We are seeing it pick back up in certain pockets and fits and starts, over the course of the year. But if you would have said, hey, Steve, what's the world going to look like for Topia when borders are closed? It probably would have been a much more bleak picture than thankfully it's turned out to be. And I think that really has come out of helping our customers work to identify new opportunities in this varied and messy climate, right? So we've done some really great work with asset managers and hedge funds in New York City, just as an example, where now that their employees are working from home, they can potentially save millions in taxes because they're outside of the city limits. So, ups and downs for sure, but I think the resilience of the team and the challenges that organizations are facing have given us an opportunity to step in and help, which has been great.
And from the conversations that you've been having with HR teams all over the world, again, I'm curious, what are the biggest challenges that they're coming to you and asking for your help with, and how are you helping them?
I'd say the biggest challenge, certainly this year, has been the where are my people question, right? I think on one hand, in the old world where the vast majority of people were in an office, the vast majority of the time, you knew at a macro level where your people were broadly. But this has been closer to, a situation where you have a real natural disaster, earthquake, tsunami, that sort of thing, and an urgency to understand precisely on that day where are my people, not where do they generally work, right? So that has been a challenge initially from the borders closing and the pandemic response. And since then, it's shifted to where are my people working today, this week, next month, because of the tax and compliance implications that come with that. So, I was talking with a customer last week, and they discovered just now in October that they've had an employee working remotely from Bali since the beginning of the year, right? And nobody knew until this week. So we're seeing an increased sort of concern around that, particularly as we head into 2021, and we expect the sort of COVID-friendly regulations to start to go by the wayside, and governments start to again crack down on individuals that are maybe working working in places they shouldn't. So a lot of the work and conversation right now is around how do we plan for next year? How do we make sure we have visibility? And frankly, how do we navigate that privacy concern that we started the conversation with today? It requires some thought and communication and conversation. And as organizations get ready for next year, a lot of efforts going into that for sure.
It's a great point you made about that worker in Bali there that nobody knew existed, because I would imagine there's a lot of new hires now that have been recruited online, interviews were online, and now they're working online. And that must bring a whole lot of challenges about making that new hire or giving that new hire a sense of belonging in a company too.
Absolutely. We've seen organizations that maybe do quite a bit of cross-border recruiting where they hire from abroad and then relocate as prior to day one. That recruiting hasn't stopped because it was generally driven for organizations by accessing talent, the right talent, right? Find me the best talent, don't care where they are, and then we'll get them to where they need to be. And over the course of this year, that the need for that talent, particularly if you look at tech or pharma or some of the industries that have had success on the backs of the change of the way in which we work and live, their challenge becomes, okay, how do I onboard that individual? How do I get them up to speed? Are they legally allowed to work for me in the country from which we've hired them? And how do we navigate some of that complexity? So, it's been a real challenge from that perspective. And I think as we head into next year, organizations are trying to figure out, okay, when can we start to move people? And we see it in some pockets, but also, how do we more agilely sort of find and deploy that talent and make sure that we're bringing them onto the team from a cultural and a sort of company perspective as quickly and effectively as possible.
Love that. And for any HR teams or HR managers and business leaders listening, is there any advice that you would leave them with today about life in 2021 as we start to prepare for that? And also, what makes you hopeful about next year and beyond too?
I think for me, the overarching, point of advice is stop waiting for the new normal. Don't wait for stability. It's not coming. I think we've been talking about the agile organization for a long time. And, we were thrust in 2020 into being agile, whether we liked it or not, right? Planning, replanning, hoping for the best, planning for the worst, over and over again. And I think that on one sense, the positive takeaway there is we've started to build that muscle from an agility perspective. And now I think a lot of organizations are looking around and going, okay, great. What do we need from a technology partner perspective to stay agile and make that par for the course, going forward, so that when a given border opens, we can make the most of that opportunity, whether it's deploying a team, creating a new entity or what have you. And when a border closes or a hotspot flares up, how do we make sure we have the data to understand where our employees are, keep them safe, and keep business running? So that need for agility, for me, I think is a key one. A recommendation that I make to folks: if you're waiting to feel stable, I think those days may have passed. When I look at what makes me hopeful about the future, is from a global talent mobility perspective, I think 2020 has raised visibility, right, of much of the complex work that those teams do around cross-border compliance and more. And for me, I think we're going to find new models of talent deployment evolving. And I think that's going to be a win both for individuals and organizations. If anything, we've been thinking about remote work and flexible ways of working for a long time, but there've been a lot of hesitation for understandable reasons. But we've proven very quickly that it can work, but we probably need to think about it a bit differently to get the most out of it. So I think we'll see topics like virtual assignments or hiring abroad and maybe working remotely for a few months before relocating, or thinking about talent rotations in maybe a different light than we used to pre-COVID. So a lot of passion, a lot of excitement. I think it's been a year of uncertainty, but I think we're all probably in a better place than we might have predicted if you'd sort of set the scene for the global climate. So it gives me optimism and hope that the most exciting times are still yet to come.
Excellent. And for anyone that would like to continue this conversation we started today or find out more information about the work that you're doing, where's the best way of finding you guys online and contacting your team?
Absolutely. So the best way to find us is at topia.com. Also on Twitter and all the various social channels at Topia_official. And I'm always happy to have a chat on the subject. And folks can reach me at steve@topia.com.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I think now more than ever, there is this increased need for a technology platform that helps enterprise companies manage their global talent mobility strategy and beyond. It's such a huge topic right now. A big thank you for taking the time to share that with me today.
Absolutely, Neil. It was my pleasure and great to connect.
So many big talking points in our conversation there, such as the increased need for a technology platform that can help enterprises and big businesses manage their global talent mobility strategy. Because yes, COVID has created challenges with employees now working not just in the office, not at home, but anywhere and everywhere. And there's also new challenges arising, such as employee tracking, because people are travelling away for the weekend. And policies demand that people are required to tell HR where they went. And yes, despite many believing this is a violation of their privacy, companies do need that information for the safety of all their employees, as well as look at COVID-19 hot zones. It's such a tough balance to get right. And I'm curious, how are you and your company dealing with all the challenges that we've mentioned in today's episode? Please, I'd love for you to share how you're dealing with it, and maybe your comments, your experiences, your insights will help other people listening out there. So please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. My website is techblogwriter.co.uk. Keep your thoughts coming in. And if you've got any questions or you'd like to come on the show, again, send me a quick message. But that's it for today. So all that's left for me to say is a big thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.